There are moments in television history that nobody plans for. Moments that arrive without a rehearsal, without a publicist standing just off camera, without the careful choreography that usually wraps powerful people in a comfortable layer of protection. Moments that cut through the performance and land somewhere real, somewhere human, somewhere that the audience feels before they fully understand what they are witnessing. And then there are moments that a man has been quietly carrying toward for 95 years, accumulating weight with every passing decade, waiting, perhaps without even knowing it, for the right room, the right stillness, the right pressure of age finally pressing down hard enough on his chest that the only honest thing left to do is let it out. This is one of those moments. You might know Clint Eastwood as the man who never flinched, the jaw that never trembled, the eyes that looked through danger the way most men look through glass. For decades, that image was so perfectly maintained, so carefully and deliberately constructed, that the world forgot something essential. Somewhere behind the legend, behind the long silences and the slow walk and the voice that sounded like gravel wrapped in calm, there was a man. A real, complicated, deeply imperfect man. A man who had buried friends and lost loves and walked away from people he should have stayed for. A man who had made choices that no Oscar statuette could ever balance out, no matter how many times the Academy called his name. A man who had spent the better part of a century building walls so precisely engineered that even the people closest to him sometimes forgot there was something living behind them. And at 95 years old, in front of live cameras, with the whole world watching, that man finally showed up. What he said stopped the room cold. Not because it was theatrical. Not because it had been written by a team of handlers designed to make him seem vulnerable in a strategically useful way. But because it was the last thing anyone expected from Clint Eastwood. Because men like him, men who spent entire careers demonstrating that emotion was something to be controlled rather than expressed, rarely choose to let the world see what lives in the quiet spaces underneath the image. And when they finally do, when the armor comes off even slightly, you feel it somewhere deep. You feel it in the way you feel the end of something important. But to understand what he shared that day, and why it landed the way it did, and why it mattered in a way that went far beyond the usual celebrity news cycle, you have to go back. All the way back. Before the Oscars. Before Hollywood. Before the westerns and the thrillers and the courtroom dramas that defined American cinema for 50 years. You have to go back to a little boy in San Francisco who learned very early, in the most formative and unforgiving way, that the world was not a place that rewarded softness. Clint Eastwood was born on May 31, 1930, into a family that was about to be tested by forces larger than any of them could anticipate or control. His father, Clinton Sr., worked as a bond salesman. His mother, Ruth, held the household together with a quiet and practical determination that never quite made it into the public story her son later told about his upbringing. On paper, the family sounds stable enough. 2 parents, a clear address, a life taking shape in the orderly way lives are supposed to take shape. But the Great Depression had arrived in America and it did not care about anyone's plans. It moved through livelihoods like a slow and indifferent fire, and the Eastwood family felt the heat of it in the most immediate possible way. Work disappeared for his father, came back briefly, then disappeared again. Salesman, detective, something else entirely. Then the moving started. And once it started, it did not stop. By the time young Clint was old enough to understand what was happening around him, he had already lived in more homes than most children inhabit in an entire childhood. San Francisco gave way to areas near Oakland. Small apartments with thin walls and unfamiliar streets that never quite softened into something that felt like home. Every time he began to recognize a neighborhood, to memorize which corner smelled like bread in the morning or which playground had the broken swing on the left side, the family packed up and started over somewhere new. And something about that relentless uprooting, that constant beginning again, planted something in him. A rootlessness. A self-reliance born not from strength but from the simple necessity of a child who learned that attachment was a luxury his circumstances could not reliably afford. But here is where the story gets complicated. And here is where the myth and the man begin to quietly separate from each other for the very first time. Because by 1940, the family had settled in Piedmont, California. And Piedmont was not the landscape of hardship that Eastwood would later describe in interviews across decades of carefully managed public appearances. Piedmont was quiet and genuinely comfortable. Country clubs behind manicured hedges. Space. Stability. A neighborhood that represented exactly the kind of steady, respectable American life that millions of families were desperately trying to claw their way toward during those years. The Eastwoods were not wealthy, but they were settled. They had cars. They had access. They had, in real and measurable terms, more than most. What the public never saw was just how deliberately that early truth was buried beneath a better story. Because the hardship narrative, the one about a rough boy forged by poverty and instability into something tough and self-made, that narrative became the foundation of the Clint Eastwood brand. It made him relatable. It made him believable as the silent man on screen who came from nothing and owed nothing to anyone. It made audiences feel that the toughness was real because the struggle had been real. And in the early years, the struggle was real. But by the time he was a teenager in Piedmont, attending school in a wealthy enclave and moving through a life that looked nothing like deprivation, the story had already started running ahead of the facts. And he let it run. Because even then, even before Hollywood taught him anything, Clint Eastwood understood the power of a well-constructed image. School was where the first public cracks appeared. He was not a natural student. He struggled with grades and repeated a year, sitting in classrooms that felt like traps to a mind that was restless in ways nobody around him had the tools to properly address. At Piedmont High School, the frustration stopped being quiet. He broke rules deliberately and loudly. He burned an effigy on school grounds. He wrote something crude and intentionally provocative on a school scoreboard. This was not the gentle rebellion of a dreaming misfit. This was a young man with something boiling underneath him that he had not yet learned to channel into anything constructive. The school asked him to leave. He transferred to Oakland Technical High School and graduated in 1949 with no clear direction and no particular urgency about finding one. What followed were years that no documentary lingers on because they did not look like the beginning of anything yet. He drifted through jobs the way he had drifted through neighborhoods as a child. Lifeguard, grocery clerk, paper carrier, forest firefighter, steel worker, golf caddy. None of it held him for long. None of it felt like a destination. For a stretch he ended up in Oregon working at a pulp mill. Long brutal days in physically demanding and genuinely dangerous conditions. Until the afternoon a stack of lumber shifted and came crashing toward him, and he moved just fast enough to escape it. He never dramatized it afterward. Just another close call. Another bad day survived. But those near misses were accumulating in his personal history in ways that would eventually matter enormously. Then, in 1951, the Army drafted him. And even that turned out differently than it might have. While thousands of young men his age were shipping out to the front lines of the Korean War, Eastwood was assigned to Fort Ord in California, working as a swim instructor and lifeguard rather than a soldier in a combat zone. Luck, again, bending things in his direction at the critical moment. But the most defining experience of his military years had nothing to do with any official assignment. It happened in the dark, somewhere over the cold Pacific Ocean, when he caught a ride on a military plane heading back to base and the plane went down. Fog. Dangerously low fuel. No safe landing strip within reach. The aircraft hit the water at night and Clint Eastwood swam for his life through black freezing waves alongside the pilot, pushing through exhaustion and fear and a darkness that felt like it had no edge, until they finally dragged themselves ashore and waited to be found. He spoke about it afterward in the fewest possible words. Just another bad day, he said. And then he moved on. But what the public didn't see was even more shocking than the silence he kept around that night. Because that instinct, that remarkable capacity to survive something genuinely devastating and then refuse to let it become the center of his story, became the hidden engine of everything that followed. When his service ended in 1953 and he arrived in Los Angeles with almost nothing to his name, using the GI Bill to study acting while digging swimming pools under the hot California sun and driving garbage trucks before sunrise to cover his rent, he was running entirely on that engine. Audition after audition that went nowhere. Door after door that stayed closed. Studio executives at Universal who signed him and then released him less than 2 years later, pointing at everything from his voice to his teeth to the way he carried himself as evidence that he simply did not have what it took. Too stiff, too tall, too slow, too much of the wrong things and not enough of anything the industry knew how to use. He stayed anyway, He showed up the next day and the day after that and the day after that. Not because he was certain it would work, but because leaving would have required him to admit that the door was truly closed. And Clint Eastwood did not admit things easily. In 1959, Rawhide arrived, and with it an audience of millions who came to recognize his face without yet understanding what he was capable of. Television made him familiar, but inside the industry that familiarity worked against him. To the studios, the networks, the gatekeepers of what was considered serious American cinema, he was a television cowboy. A pleasant and reliable face on a small screen in people's living rooms. Useful, not important. And then came the role that rewrote everything. And even that almost went to someone else entirely. The script that would become Dirty Harry moved first through Frank Sinatra's hands, then to John Wayne, then to Paul Newman. Sinatra had health and contract concerns. Wayne felt the material was too violent and politically extreme for his image. Newman worried the moral muddiness of the character would damage the careful reputation he had built. Only after all three said no did the script find its way to Eastwood at 41. Accepting the role for a modest salary but negotiating a meaningful share of the profits. That decision, made almost by a process of elimination rather than any grand Hollywood design, produced one of the most recognizable characters in the history of American film and taught Eastwood something he never forgot. Controversy, if you were steady enough to stand inside it without flinching, was not a liability. It was an accelerant. But behind the rising career and the hardening legend, something else entirely was taking shape in the shadows. And this is where the story becomes genuinely difficult to tell cleanly. Because for all the extraordinary discipline and control that Clint Eastwood brought to his work, his private life was a different landscape entirely. Multiple relationships running simultaneously, often invisibly to the people involved in each of them. Children born into secrecy, their father's name absent from birth records in ways that would take decades to untangle publicly. A daughter named Lori whose very existence was kept hidden from the world for nearly 40 years. 8 children with 6 different women, though even serious biographers have quietly noted that the full and accurate accounting may be something no one will ever know with complete certainty. And then there was Sondra Locke. Their relationship lasted more than a decade. She appeared in his films. She built her life around a shared future that she believed was real. And when it ended, what happened next was something the courtroom would later describe in terms that left very little room for charitable interpretation. A deal was quietly arranged with Warner Brothers that appeared, on its surface, to be a generous gesture of support for her directing career. Office space, development funding, 3 years of financial backing to pitch and develop projects. On paper, it looked like a helping hand extended by a powerful man to a woman whose career had genuine promise. In reality, she pitched more than 30 projects across those 3 years. Every single one was rejected, and it later emerged in court that the entire arrangement had been secretly funded through Eastwood himself, a hidden reimbursement agreement he had never disclosed to her or to her legal team. When the truth surfaced and she sued for fraud, Eastwood admitted in testimony that he had concealed the funding. By the second day of jury deliberations, the vote was reportedly moving decisively against him. The case settled before a final verdict could be delivered, for an amount that was never made public. But the damage was not financial. The damage was the curtain being pulled back. And once that curtain opened, the image on the other side was nothing like the one the world had been looking at for 30 years. What the public didn't see was even more devastating than what the headlines captured. Because beneath the legal language and the courtroom testimony was a simpler and more human truth. A woman who had loved him and trusted him had found her future professionally closed off, quietly and systematically, by the very man who had the power to open it. And he had done it while hiding his involvement with a precision that mirrored the control he exercised over every other aspect of his public life. Long before the broader culture developed the vocabulary to describe that kind of behavior clearly, the Sondra Locke story was already describing it in painful and specific detail. Unforgiven arrived in 1992 and found Eastwood at 62, in a Hollywood that had already begun writing quiet obituaries for his relevance. Some critics suggested openly that his time as a major force had passed. The Western genre was considered commercially dead. The film looked, to many industry insiders, like the nostalgic effort of a fading star attempting to drag something long buried back into the light. And then the film opened, and the room went quiet in the way that only truly great cinema makes a room go quiet. And on March 29, 1993, Unforgiven won Best Picture, Best Director, Best Supporting Actor, and Best Editing, and Clint Eastwood stood at the podium not just collecting awards but completing a reinvention so total that it effectively erased the version of the story where he was finished. He did it again at 74 with Million Dollar Baby. Best Picture, Best Director, the oldest man ever to win that particular award at that point in history. The film had arrived wrapped in serious controversy. Disability rights groups protesting its ending loudly and publicly, critics and radio hosts accusing it of suggesting that certain lives were not worth living. And yet the Academy embraced it, audiences filled theaters, and Eastwood found himself once again at the precise center of a storm that somehow made him larger rather than smaller. Then at 93, he directed Juror Number 2, the oldest filmmaker ever to direct a major studio production. The shoot was interrupted by a SAG-AFTRA strike that forced the entire production to stop mid-filming, with the industry openly wondering whether a 93-year-old man, dealing with reported physical difficulties and the enormous pressure of keeping a crew together through uncertainty, would be able to resume when the strike finally ended. He resumed. He finished. And then Warner Brothers released the completed film on approximately 30 screens nationwide. A release so narrow that most of the country never knew it existed. For a man who had just made history, it felt less like a celebration and more like a quiet burial. Some argued the studio was protecting him from a wider commercial failure. Others saw it simply as disrespect. Either way, the contrast between what he had achieved and how the studio treated the achievement was stark enough to make people genuinely angry on his behalf. And then in 2025, at 95 years old, came the moment that pulled everything together into something that no awards ceremony or controversy or film could have produced on its own. An Austrian publication released what it presented as a fresh interview with Eastwood, filled with sharp observations about modern Hollywood, about aging, about sequels, and the state of the industry. The quotes spread rapidly across entertainment media. People shared them as proof that he was still sharp, still engaged, still pushing forward with the same stubborn energy that had defined every decade of his career. And then on June 1, 2025, Eastwood contacted Deadline directly and stated clearly that the interview was entirely fabricated. He had never spoken to the publication. The quotes had been assembled from old comments and presented dishonestly as a new conversation. Even at 95, he was significant enough that a fake version of his voice could travel around the world before the real one had a chance to correct it. It was in the aftermath of all of that, the fake interview, the correction, the renewed public attention on a man who had now outlived most of the people who had ever doubted him, that the live television moment arrived. And when it arrived without announcement and without the protective scaffolding that usually surrounds moments of public vulnerability for people at his level of fame. He spoke about the people who were no longer there, about Eric Fleming, his co-star from Rawhide, who died in a Peruvian river in 1966, young and completely gone before any of the great years had a chance to arrive. About the expanding and irreversible list of collaborators and friends and people he had loved in whatever way he was capable of loving them, who had disappeared across the decades until the act of simply surviving long enough to become a legend also became the act of surviving long enough to carry more grief than most people accumulate across an entire lifetime. He spoke about regret, not in the polished, carefully managed way that famous people speak about regret when they want to appear humble without actually surrendering anything real. He spoke about it the way a 95-year-old man speaks about it when the accounting is finally, completely, and undeniably finished. The children he had not been present for in the ways that mattered most. The women he had moved through without the honesty and consistency they had every right to expect. The choices that had looked like strength or practicality or simple self-preservation at the time and that looked, from this distance, like something he no longer had a comfortable name for. The room was very quiet. Because when a man who built his entire legend on the strategic power of silence finally chooses to speak, the silence around his words becomes the most important sound in the room. And what Clint Eastwood shared that day on live television was not simply sad news in the celebrity sense of that phrase. It was not a health announcement or a professional setback or a family dispute arriving in public. It was something far rarer and far more difficult to produce after 95 years of building walls. It was an honest man, finally, at the very edge of everything, setting down the story he had been carrying and picking up the truth instead. He is still working. He has not announced a retirement. He has made clear, in the way only he can make things clear, with the minimum number of words and the maximum amount of finality, that time will not write the ending for him. He will write it himself, or he will not accept it at all. And maybe that is the most essentially Clint Eastwood thing about all of it. That even now, even with the full weight of a life that enormous resting on his chest, even with the losses and the regrets and the quiet devastation of outliving almost everyone who once stood beside him, he is still refusing to stop, still arriving, still insisting, against all reasonable evidence, that there is more to come. But for one unscripted, unguarded, unrepeatable moment on live television, in front of a room that went completely still, he let the world see what was underneath the armor. He let the world see the man the legend was built to protect and the man the legend was built to hide. And that moment, small and quiet and utterly without performance, will outlast every frame of film he ever shot. Because it was the one thing Clint Eastwood spent 95 years almost never giving to anyone: the unguarded truth.